There's no doubt that Saudi Arabia is a key player. It's one of the largest economies. It's got its finger on the energy market, so it's a key player in terms of globalized energy markets.
Hello and welcome to Insight from Abroad. This podcast is part of the Middle East and South Asia initiative in the College of Sciences at the University of Central Florida. My name is Pauline Kabambi. Our mission here is to educate, engage, and influence the international community. Today I'm joined by Dr. Robert Mogielnicki. So that our listeners are aware, Dr. Mogielnicki is a resident scholar at the Arab Gulf State Institute in Washington. He manages the Institute Political Economy Research and oversees the Next Gen Gulf, a long-term research series that examines how advanced technologies shape Gulf Arab government. Dr. Mogielnicki previously worked as a consultant and journalist across the Middle East and North Africa. His current research interests lie on how the Gulf states engage in the process of economic transformation. Regarding his academic career, Dr. Mogielnicki received his PhD from the University of Oxford, Magdalen College, and his Master's in Modern Middle Eastern Studies from Oxford St. Anthony's College. He conducted his doctoral research on the political economy of free zones in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, and his master's thesis examined labor policy formulation and implementation in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. His published work has appeared in Foreign Policy, The Banker, and Axios. Dr. Mogielnicki also regularly provides commentary for international media outlets, including Forbes, Nikkei Asian Review, Financial Times, Reuters, BBC World News TV, Vox, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and C&P Global. Dr. Mogielnicki, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Firstly, could you tell us more about your background? We'd like to know more about you.
Absolutely. So, thank you very much for the comprehensive introduction. I'm a resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. As you mentioned, I manage the political economy portfolio there, so that's a very wide-ranging area of research. I look at everything from trade to finance to labor markets, and increasingly I'm exploring the role of technology in the region. So I have this long-term research series that looks at the role of technology and how it's transforming government and economic processes in the region. And I look at that through short pieces, longer reports, and also holding events. Previously, I've spent a number of years in North Africa and in Gulf Arab states. And then I've had a few years of academic experiences, and I'm quite happy to be beyond the PhD stage, and being based in Washington is an excellent place to be at the moment.
That's quite interesting. But as I mentioned, your studies focus more on the Middle East politics. Can you tell us why? Are you highly invested in the Middle East politics?
Sure. Well, I would describe myself as a political economist, so I'm looking for the areas wherein politics and economics intersect. And I look broadly at the Middle East, but specifically in Gulf Arab states. It's very much my view that you cannot separate the politics from the economics, nor the economics from the politics in the region. So even though a lot of my interests fall on the economic side, it's extremely important for me to stay in touch with what's going on the political front, to see how those political trends and factors are shaping economic outcomes.
Quite interesting. So I would like to have your opinion on this. Recently, President Trump revealed his Trump peace plan for the Middle East, which intend to resolve the ongoing issue of Israeli-Palestinian land conflict. President Trump emphasized that the proposal intends to benefit both parties. But, however, the deal has been supported by Israel and rejected by Palestine. In fact, the Palestinians were not involved in the making of the proposal and also were not invited to the launch party. Do you think the Trump peace deal will promote peace in the Middle East?
Well, the short answer is no. I'm not very optimistic, and there are three reasons why. The first is, as you said, the Palestinians themselves did not sign up for this path forward, and do not seem to agree with this peace plan, and do not support the very optimistic assessment of where this will lead the Palestinians and the Israelis going forward. So, if you have a peace plan between two parties, and one of the parties is adamantly against the peace plan, that's not a very good way of starting off. Number two, the regional allies in the Middle East, Gulf Arab states, other key actors like Egypt, also have not endorsed this Middle East peace plan. In fact, many of the regional allies, the U.S.'s regional allies, have been very cautious, offering some positive words about the efforts on the one hand, but at the same time not endorsing the peace plan in a comprehensive way. So it doesn't seem that there is buy-in from key regional allies with respect to this peace plan. And finally, it's just about the ability for the Trump administration to actually stick this plan through and to realize some of the objectives and the goals of the peace plan. I've looked pretty closely at the economic components of the peace plan, and I think there are a lot of high hopes, and there are not necessarily concrete steps to realize those economic targets. So whether it's increasing GDP for the Palestinians, whether it's reducing unemployment or bringing in $50 billion of investments, the reality is that Donald Trump might not be in the White House for much longer, and even if he does secure another term, we're talking about another 4 years. The goals, the economic goals that this peace plan sets forth require a long-term, sustained initiative, and I do not believe the Trump administration will be willing or able to do that.
That's quite interesting. And as you mentioned earlier, your studies does not only focus on the political side of the Gulf state, but also the economic side of those states. So my question is, the abundant gas and oil reserve in the Gulf nations has prepared them to become one of the biggest economic booming in the world history. However, the fluctuation of oil prices and the tentative replacement of the natural gas to renewable energy and the instability of some countries makes us question the stability of the Gulf states. Do you think that the future economy of the Gulf nations look like? Is it positive or negative?
I would say that I'm cautiously optimistic. If we go back to 2014, late 2014, early 2015, we can all remember the collapse in oil prices. That brought about a reckoning in the Gulf region, and specifically in Gulf Arab states, wherein governments remain heavily dependent upon oil and gas revenues for their public sector budgets. At that time, governments across the region, from Saudi Arabia to Bahrain to Oman, the UAE, enacted a series of strategic plans and visions that put forth a process of reforms, deep economic reforms, that the goal of which being to reduce these states' dependence upon oil and gas. I think if we look back now, a few years from that period, from that very dire economic and fiscal situation in late 2014, early 2015, we can say that there's been a certain degree of uneven progress. So I would say that there has been progress on the economic reform front. There have been the introduction of new taxes, for example. So the value-added tax has been in place in Saudi Arabia and the UAE for a number of years, in Bahrain for going on to its second year now. And the remaining Gulf Arab states, Qatar, Kuwait, and Oman, have indicated plans to introduce those taxes, a value-added tax in the future, and have introduced other taxes in lieu of the value-added tax. So that's just one example where I feel, as I say, cautiously optimistic. There are examples of success being made in order to diversify government revenues away from oil and gas, and that's a good thing for the states of this region in the Middle East, and specifically Gulf Arab states. From everything that I've seen, we're looking at a period where oil and gas prices are going to remain volatile, but relatively lower than the high prices that we saw in the early 2000s. So in this economic scenario, Gulf Arab states have to be prepared to find value in other areas and other segments of the economy outside of oil and gas. And I believe that they're trying to do this. The question is, how successful will they be? And some states are going to find more success in some areas, and some are going to find more success in others, and there will certainly be some stumbling blocks along the way.
That's really interesting. So my next question is based on your recent publication with the UCF. In your recent collaboration between the Middle East Institute and UCF on the Middle East, you wrote on the economical exchange of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. And my question about that is, in your book you mentioned that in the past years there's been tension between those three countries. And do you believe that the economical and diplomatic reunification of those countries will have an impact on the global affairs, or can be felt in the US?
Well, it's a great question. I was very pleased to be invited to submit a chapter for this book, and specifically a book that looked at Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey, because these are three critical players in the Middle East region. They have Saudi Arabia and Turkey are the two largest economies in terms of GDP. Egypt has demographic heft. It's one of the most populous countries in the region. But when I did a quick survey of the economic linkages between these countries, specifically Turkey's relations with Egypt and Turkey's relations with Saudi Arabia, I was surprised that there were relatively low levels of linkages. So whether it was trade, investment, and even people-to-people flows, I was surprised by what I found. So that led me to think about what could actually explain these low levels of economic cooperation between these three critical economic players in the Middle East. And the hypothesis I put forth was, well, these are three countries that have had significant tensions in their relationship. There have been tensions on a political and diplomatic level. We can think about just the Khashoggi murder being one example of creating tensions between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, as well as Turkey's kind of alleged support for Islamist movements in Egypt and also in neighboring Libya as being another example of creating tensions in that other bilateral relationship. So I set about trying to figure out whether these diplomatic relations had actually had a negative impact over a period of time in the bilateral relations between these countries. And what I found was that didn't actually seem to be the case. Between 2011 and 2018, you could point to a number of diplomatic and political issues between these countries. But trade stayed relatively consistent. Investment was never substantial. It dipped a bit in the Saudi case. But actually, in terms of people flows, Saudis continue to go to Turkey in masses. So I think just as early as 2010 or 2011, there were less than 100,000 Saudis visiting Turkey. By 2018, that number was close to 750,000. So over this period, when the governments were at loggerheads and the governments were sending insults across to each other in person and kind of in digital formats, people were continuing to, Saudis at least, were continuing to vacation in Turkey. So where does that leave us now? I mean, that was 2018, we had 2019, now we're going to 2020. I think at the end of the day, these three countries are going to have to decide what's more important. Are the economics more important? Are diplomatic relations more important? And it's ultimately going to be up to these three players to either continue with the status quo, which I believe is more or less maintaining intense relations, stoking the fires, and then kind of making sure that things calm down, but allowing economic linkages to more or less stay where they are, or to make an effort to really repair relations and allow some of these trade, investment, and people-to-people connections to really flourish. And I think we're standing somewhat on a precipice there, and things could stay the same or they could get better. I don't see them getting substantially worse. And
in your book, you look up those three countries at a time when the U.S. was less involved in the Middle East. But I'm just curious to know, what have been the impact of the U.S. involvement in the Middle East so far?
With respect to those three countries,
Yes.
well, one of the big issues in Washington at the moment, I look at the Middle East from Washington, and a lot of Middle East analysts, researchers, and observers are worried that the U.S. role in the Middle East is less clear. That for much of the last couple of decades, the presence of the Middle East as a stabilizing force in the region was taken as a given, that this was something that people could count on. Now, U.S. policy toward the region seems to be increasingly divisive, unclear, opaque, ambiguous, increasingly partisan as well. So the question is, where does that leave regional states, your Saudi Arabia's, your Turkey's, Egypt's? I think these actors in the Middle East understand that it's upon them to secure their economies, secure their relationships with foreign actors. That this guarantee by the United States is not necessarily going to be there in the same way that it has been in the previous decades. So I believe that the U.S. has been not so much a stabilizing force; it's been a thorn in the side of many of these Middle East actors, and it's something that they have to now manage as a new reality that they're dealing with. But at the end of the day, whether we're talking about Saudi Arabia or Egypt, it still is quite clear that that the leaders in these countries find in Donald Trump, in the Trump administration, an ally, someone that they can count on, and that, to me, that bond is still there. And despite various scandals in Saudi Arabia and some other ongoing issues in Egypt, that hasn't seemed to diminish the relationship, at least on a very senior level, between the Trump administration and Egypt and Saudi Arabia.
That's quite interesting. And I would like to bring up a point that you mentioned in your book. In your book, you have described different events that have shaped the Turkey and Saudi Arabia relationship. One of them being the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, which worsened the relationship. Khashoggi was murdered in Istanbul, and in your book you mentioned that Turkey reserved comment on that issue. And also in the news we saw that Donald Trump showed support to the Saudi government but did not say much. He didn't want to be involved in that. Do you think that was a way for them to protect the economical tie?
Well, yeah, the reserved response to the Khashoggi murder on the part of the U.S., on the part of regional allies, Saudi's regional allies like Egypt, for example, did seem to be very much a cautious approach toward an ally whom they view to be critical for their safeguarding their interest in the region. There's no doubt that Saudi Arabia is a key player. It's one of the largest economies. It's got its finger on the energy market, so it's a key player in terms of globalized energy markets. There's also a lot of security cooperation with U.S. officials and with Egyptian officials as well. So close security cooperation, economic cooperation as well. If I leave the U.S. aside for a moment and talk about Egypt, one element that I didn't get to explore in the book project was actually the economic linkages between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. For the last several decades, Egypt has played a very important role as a leader of the Muslim world and of the Islamic world, and specifically the Middle East. But in recent years, it's had some economic and fiscal difficulties of its own, and increasingly it has been looking to strengthen its relationships with Gulf Arab states, with Saudi Arabia and with the United Arab Emirates. So there are an incredible amount of investments going from the Gulf, outward investments from the Gulf and into Egypt. One example that I can point to is Saudi Arabia's mega project NEOM, which it envisions to be a free zone that spans part of Saudi territory, but also would include Egyptian and Jordanian territory. This is an example wherein Saudi's kind of domestic development projects are expected to have a real boost or provide a real boost to the Egyptian economy. Just the other day, Saudi Arabia's telecoms firm also purchased a stake of Vodafone in Egypt. So that was a major sign of support for the Egyptian economy and where the Egyptian economy is heading. And also a lot of the entrepreneurs that start tech ventures in Saudi Arabia or in the UAE, they might launch their ventures in the Gulf, but they actually look toward the Egyptian market as where they can go to scale their venture, because Egypt has, three times as many citizens or residents than Saudi Arabia, which is the most populous country. Maybe it's close to 9 or 10 times as many residents as the United Arab Emirates. So if we keep this in mind, I think, yes, it was incumbent upon the Egyptians to be reserved in how they approached that very sensitive topic, so that they could maintain strong links with Saudi Arabia. And as for Donald Trump, I think and the Trump administration, he has other plans for the Middle East, and we just saw the launch of this Middle East peace plan, much kind of broader deals to broker. I don't think creating a fuss over Jamal Khashoggi was in Donald Trump's playbook. And I'll leave it there. As for the rest of his calculations, I can't exactly speculate, but that's what I assume was the case.
That's quite interesting. And I would like to bring one point that you mentioned in your book. You say that there is a relatively low level of economic cooperation between those three countries, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. But nevertheless, the vast economic potential associated with closer bilateral partnership and should encourage future political economic studies of those three influential regional actors. But my question is the following. Could you tell us more about the potential economic bilateral partnership that can happen if those countries decide to come together?
Yeah, so I think across the board on the trade front, you could see increased levels of trade. So trade could broadly increase. There have been a number of agreements signed between Turkey and Egypt to facilitate trade. One was the free trade agreement that was launched earlier in the 2000s. That's coming up for a renewal, and it's actually been a point of contention for a lot of members of parliament in Egypt who believe that Egyptians should not be benefiting from this partnership with Turkey when Turkey is creating, in their view, instability next door in Libya, and also supporting Islamists, which is another very sensitive point for Egypt. So there are some areas, the renewal of a free trade agreement would allow trade between the two countries to continue to kind of move in the right direction. If that was not renewed, or if it was canceled, then things would be looking much more dire on the trade front. In terms of investments, there's a lot of room for growth in Saudi investments, specifically in Turkey. So one of the clearest points of the research was that from about 2011 or 12, Saudi investments in Turkey started to decline. From around 2.5 or 2.6 billion down to as low as 625 million. Now, the same happened, by the way, for the United Arab Emirates. Both the UAE and Saudi Arabia started to decrease their investments in Turkey, at least in terms of capital equity stocks in the country. But at the same time, Qatar came into the picture and started to prop up those investments. So the total capital equity in the country stayed at about $11 billion. Despite the fact that the UAE and Saudi Arabia were pulling out, Qatar was coming in a serious way and putting forth billions of dollars into the country. So to my mind, if relations repair between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and we see that capital flooding back into Turkey, then Turkey's going to have a real boost in terms of inward foreign FDI, foreign direct investment. Because presumably the Qatari investments will stay, and then you can see the return of Saudi and Emirati investors. So there's a real potential in terms of inward investments to Turkey. On the people flows, I'm not so sure. I think that growth in Saudi tourists to Turkey has been growing at really breakneck speed. I don't know how much more room there is for growth. This year, before coming here, I checked a 9-month stats for tourist arrivals from Saudi Arabia to Turkey, and there was actually a 20% decrease from the previous year. So I think maybe we're seeing a point where the growth in Saudi tourists to Turkey has kind of reached has peaked. And also there are a lot of domestic tourism initiatives in Saudi Arabia as well. So there are more opportunities for Saudis to stay within the country and to find entertainment and also to visit tourism sites. So I think that will probably hurt Turkey's opportunities or chances of attracting more tourists. So if I had to pinpoint an area of growth potential, I'd say it's on the investment front.
Investment front. That's really interesting to learn. My last question will be, is there any developing project or research that you have conducted that you have interest in that you would like to share with us?
Sure. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, I launched back in May of 2019 a research series, Next Gen Gulf. And the goal was to look at the role of advanced technologies in the region. So artificial intelligence, financial technologies, which could include cryptocurrencies or blockchain, and then looking kind of in a more broad level, the Internet of Things, how governments across the region are adopting these technologies, implementing them within the societies, and then trying to examine the changes that they are making. And to me, it's an area that there's a significant gap in scholarship and research on. And when I visited the Middle East, that's what everyone was talking about: technology, cryptocurrencies, and digital currencies, and payment systems, and tech startups. And this was what was creating a buzz in the region. When I went back to Washington, we had a lot of people talking about the same old foreign policy debates and politics and democratization. And not to say that those topics aren't important, but I think there is certainly a growing space to explore the role of tech in the region. And I just wrote a piece today that will be coming out on electronic currencies in the region, and specifically in Yemen. So this is not just the role of advanced technologies. It's not just a story for the very mature and developed economies of, say, the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia. I mean, the Houthis in Yemen have launched a digital currency of the Yemeni rial, and that has created just a host of issues and problems. So it wasn't necessarily a solution per se, but nevertheless, it's a advanced technology that's being adopted within the region by actors, both by state actors and non-state actors. And this is an area that is fascinating to me. I think it's an area to watch, and that's kind of the main focus for me as part of my political economy portfolio.
Well, Dr. Mogielnicki, it has been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today, and we thank you so much for being here and sharing your experiences with us. If you want to learn more about today's guest, our mission, and our program, you can visit us at PMBF website or go follow any of our social media pages. For the Middle East and South Asia Studies program here at UCF, this is Pauline Kabambi. Thank you for listening.